Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you, featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. I want to thank Albert Kaufman from Gladiator Publishing for recommending one of its fantastic authors. He was on our show recently. On YouTube, look up the Susan Brender Show. You'll find Albert Kaufman. Today, my guest is Terri Gallagher, author of Death of the Gold Watch, a successful entrepreneur and gig workforce expert. Terri has made it into her personal mission to shift her industry by leveraging a trademark ecosystem model of delivery that includes best-of-breed talent, technology, and alliance partners to provide contingent workforce and total talent management solutions. Now, her experience as a thought leader and workforce solutions disruptor has enabled her to provide the best-in-class workforce solutions for several global and domestic contingent workforce programs. $10 million to $2 billion in spend. Can you imagine that? For Fortune 100 and 500 clients across all sectors. Now, her thing is finance, healthcare, management, retail, and telecom. Her perfected strategies will optimize the changing market as it saturates more and more every year with gig workforce professionals. Now, I want to thank Terri Gallagher and welcome Terri to my show.
Susan, hi, thank you. And that is quite a write-up, which I helped with, obviously. And I'm sure people are going to have some questions like, what does that mean? So hopefully we can answer that in the interview today. And definitely very excited to be here. And thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's my pleasure, and you're absolutely right. You beat me to the punch. I was going to ask just that question. What does that mean?
Well, really, the reason that I'm writing this book is, there's been a lot of changes in the way and the how and the where that we work, and everybody hears a lot about the gig economy and the gig workforce, and is it Uber, is it independent consultants? And so my company helps other companies understand what that workforce is and how it's changing the way that we work and how to leverage this new workforce and put processes and strategies around it so that this workforce can be embraced. For some companies, it's a third or half of their workforce is not traditional permanent talent. And there's a lot of questions around how do we find this talent? How do we manage it? How do we engage this talent? And so that's really what I do, and that's what my company does, is we answer those questions.
Terri, thank you for telling us about this, because this is really a complicated business model, if you will, and I'm very interested in knowing how did you get started in something like this, because needless to say, this is not an easy job, and writing a book, that's wonderful, because as you progress, so does our audience as they listen to the things that you do. So tell us why. Why did you start something like this?
You know what? I have no idea. No, I'm just kidding. It was one of those things I was like, I think I'll write a book. And someone said, you should write a book. And, of course, it's quite an undertaking. But to your point, a lot of people don't really understand this workforce and what it means to us as not just from a corporate standpoint, but as a society. And so I come from staffing. So I've worked for all the big staffing companies that have primarily dominated this space and dominated putting together strategies around, temporary and gig workforce and contract labor and independent consultants. But the focus has always been more on just staffing and providing more of those resources rather than thought leadership and guidance on how to really leverage this workforce more effectively. And so the reason I'm writing this book is I think there's a lot of terminology being tossed around, around what is the gig workforce and who are they. And there's a lot of information that's coming out from politicians that talk about, this workforce is being taken advantage of and they're not getting benefits. And the reality is most people that are in this workforce choose to be here. And so I really wanted to come from a place of education, to educate people the how and the why and for whom this work has changed. And I wanted to do it very simply and not come from a place of self-serving. Obviously, my company sells these solutions, but I really wanted to educate.
Well, I can't help but asking this, and we live in a society today which is evolving, very quickly, and needless to say, they're bringing robots onto the industrial side of things, and also in companies to do virtually everything, and even personally. Now, that means, as far as I'm concerned, that you're going to lose a lot of the jobs because the robots are going to be doing the jobs. Now, this is not exactly up your alley, if you will, but I have to ask you, what do you think about that?
There's a lot. I could use a robot right now, actually. I wouldn't mind getting rid of some of the more, transactional tasks. But, there definitely is, people hear about AI and the robots taking over, and the reality is they are. They are taking over certain tasks, certain types of jobs. You see it in manufacturing where some of the more manual labor, repetitive, is being taken over by robots. But you know what? New jobs are being created because someone has to manage the robots and program them. So to me, AI and the robots, and you see this even in my space, recruiting, and you have robots, scouring social profiles and sourcing for talent, recruiting, it's really replacing a lot of lower-end transactional activities that humans are not best served doing. We build relationships and we're strategic thinkers. So it's really elevating us as a humanity. It's elevating the humans to do more of the things that we're much better at and taking some of the transactional and some of the repetitive things away to really, elevate productivity and to elevate what companies can achieve.
I hear you. And, I want to tell you something. I had a discussion yesterday with a few friends, and we talked all about this robotics, and there's all kinds of information out there that is now in the newspapers and magazines all about how we're living in a society which is really transactional, that it's moving and moving and moving, and how do you fit into that? Is your business changing, and is your book, you're going to write another book which is going to really talk about all of the things that right now you think are important? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've heard this before. We're in a new industrial revolution, with the robots and with the millennials changing the way that we work. People aren't working for companies for 20 and 30 years anymore, i.e. death of the gold watch. You get the gold watch at, the end of your retirement. And so, this book is really about how we've changed and how the way that we work has changed. And this isn't something that's being inflicted on us as the workforce. Companies are not saying, hey, I think it'll be a lot cheaper to use contingent workers or Uber workers. We're driving it because of the way we want to work. And millennials don't want to stay somewhere for 20 years. They want to work on a couple projects and be inspired. And so we're driving it. And so that's really what's driving these shifts and these changes. And so in my book, I talk about what those changes are and really what are the drivers for those changes, and then how it's really shifting the way that we work, and it's shifting the way that big companies have to now look at workforce. When you looked at 200 years ago, it was top down, right? You got some big dude, behind a mahogany desk.
Yeah.
He's the boss. It's usually a guy. And then, all of the culture and all of the, the way that this company is going to operate is driven from the top down. And then you have the workers that have to, follow that paradigm. Well, now it's more about networks than top down. It's more about collaboration. It's more about a workforce being fluid, a mix of somebody who's working there a week and gone, and then a permanent person, and then maybe an independent consultant. So it's really, we've flipped the script on how we work. And so I think people need to know what that means to them. And that's really why I'm writing this book.
I hear you loud and clear. Now, the brick and mortar companies that existed years ago, who would make the people feel like they were part of a family. I think about IBM as an example. These kinds of paradigms have changed totally. Now people are working out of their homes. They're always on the road. Women, and we're going to touch base, talking a little bit about women and what you think is happening. Are there more women participating in all the jobs that are available? I don't think so. I have to say to you that there still is a situation where women don't become engineers, maybe mathematics, I'm not sure, but definitely not the engineers that men are, because, well, you answer me. I mean, why not? Why are women not going into careers of that nature?
That's amazing you just asked that. I was actually at a panel discussion last night with Society of Information Management, and they hosted several female entrepreneurs that have started tech startups or fintech startups, and they talked about what those barriers are. And I think that there's definitely a shift happening. You know, you've got the whole Me Too movement, and you're seeing more awareness around, you know, women and executive profiles, and women taking place and, you know, having more female presence with boards and being board directors. And particularly in STEM, you know, there's just a lot of the conversation was really about what are the barriers to bringing women in STEM. And sometimes it's cultural, you know, where women, depending on where they are or their family structure, you know, they're not always encouraged to learn about coding, and that's not necessarily very feminine. And then you've got, you know, barriers to entry where you've got companies that are really genuinely trying to encourage more women to join their company, but then women have unique challenges that other people don't have, i.e. they're still the primary caregivers for the children in the home, and so they need more flexibility. So companies are looking at that. And when you talk about brick and mortar, you know, allowing that flexibility in that remote work situation and creating an environment where women can, you know, to adapt to some of their unique challenges, there's an opportunity to do that. But I think it's both sides of the coin. I think it's the way women are socialized, that, you know, STEM is not a typical career you would choose. And then the companies creating environments where they feel comfortable pursuing those careers and not walking into a meeting and you're the only woman there, which is something I heard quite a bit with women that have elevated themselves. They still walk into a board meeting and they're still the minority.
Set this up for me. I want our audience to understand things about business and how they operate, you know, what they need to do to move forward. So here you are. Okay, so you go into a company, you go into a conference, and you're there to discuss gig, okay, your company, and the advantages of it. Give me a scenario of what you would like to see happen when you walk into that company and you talk to them about all the different things you're doing and, of course, your book. So, you know, set me up. Give me a scenario.
That's a great question. You know, I think the biggest thing what I'd like to have happen is that this company really understands the different types of talent that are now in the gig workforce. You know, there's a misperception that leveraging independent contractors or contract labor or temporary labor or gig workers is they're not going to be as talented, or they're not going to be as reliable, or they're not going to stay. And the reality is, particularly in technology and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, some of your best talent is only in these communities because that's the way they want to work. So I think it's educating them on the availability of high-quality talent, educating them on the fact that this is a way to expand your talent, you know, options, right? Because right now we really are in the middle of some pretty substantial talent challenges with the baby boomers leaving and a lot of skills, you know, going out the door and going away. And so looking at this workforce as very viable, and also looking at this workforce this is how we as a society are working today. Roughly half of our workforce, it's predicted 40 to 50% is going to be independent in a couple of years, half. And so
Interesting. All right, so now let's look at this side. You're invited to speak at a college, and they ask you to bring your book, and they say to you, okay, look, these students they haven't made any decisions about what they want to do yet because they just take a bachelor's degree and they hope that they'll find a job of some sort. They don't know what it is, but they just feel that, okay, they'll find their way. Do you think they're going to find their way? Or would you want to give them some advice, and what would the advice be?
I think that's a great question, and I think that hasn't changed, and I don't think that'll ever change, is what do I do now that I have this degree? What do I want to be when I grow up? And I think the advice that I would give them is, permanent labor is never going to go away. It's always going to be foundational for a company, but the advice I would give them is to look at, maybe participating in the gig economy and participating and signing up for some of these on-demand and digital workforce platforms that are the delivery system for delivering this talent to companies, and, maybe just try it. It's certainly a great way to get paid very well, and try out different companies, try out different types of roles, and just participate in it. And I think that it's certainly a viable opportunity, whereas 10 years ago, it's not something that would be considered when you get that degree from Harvard and you've got 20 recruiters calling you. Most people may want to go directly to a Big Five consulting or whatever, but I guess that would be my advice is I'll send them, they can call me and I could definitely give them some options where they could go, but there's really great opportunities in the gig workforce and in the gig economy that they may not be privy to or even know about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's get back to your book for a moment, because the book tells you about how companies will have to change in ways they find and keep workers. They it's not easy because the choices this brings up a point to me. Choices. Do you think we should have a lot of choices, or if we live in a society today where everything is changing, just kind of cut it down to a couple of choices, therefore people will kind of identify what they want to do. Otherwise, there's too many choices out there, they can't make up their minds. So what do you say about that?
Well, I'll quote, I actually had a really interesting conversation yesterday with an Uber driver. And this is not very scientific, obviously, but he was talking about the fact that he works for UPS and he also works for Uber. And he says he loves the fact that he can look his daughter in the eye when she says, Daddy, can we go to the park today? It's a Saturday, and he can say yes because he's got that flexibility. He can go and jump in Uber tomorrow if he wants to make more money. He's got a part-time job with UPS. And so I think that the choices are not necessarily a bad thing, because choice equals flexibility. It equals you can make as much or as little money as you want. And if you want more stability and you're not as comfortable with, the unstable nature of gig workforce, then you've got that permanent job that you can go to, and you can certainly take that path. But I think the choices are a good thing. And the reason people step into the gig economy is because they like the flexibility, they like the creativity, they like being able to call the shots. And with this Uber driver, they like being able to say, yes, honey, I can go to the park with you today.
Yeah. And, another thing that's really interesting is the fact that people today, they want to spend more time with their family. There was a time where, and it still exists, where if you were a special employee of a hedge fund or became a lawyer, you would have to work like 20 hours a day because they feel that there's just too much to accomplish, and they don't want to let you, work just say your 6 or 7 or 8 hour day. And that's pretty horrible. So as I said before, do you feel that people are interested now in being with their families more and having travel a little bit more and doing things that give them a little bit pleasure rather than having to work like 20 hours, if you will?
Absolutely. I do. I think the pendulum has kind of swung the other way. And certainly from what I've been reading, I don't have stats in front of me, but the things I'm reading, and I read pretty frequently, is that we are seeing a shift where people want to spend more time with their families, or just have the flexibility to have the time on their terms, what they spend it on. And, we keep talking about millennials, but, they want to do something interesting and be engaged and be appreciated and work on a project for a couple of years and then maybe go somewhere else or travel for a couple of months and come back and do something else. So I think that flexibility is key. And the other thing, too, is, the gig economy is providing work streams and ways to earn income that did not exist before. So people that talk about, the fact that these workers are not getting benefits and they're not really being taken care of, most of the ones that I talk to are fine with the fact that they've also got different work streams or different ways of earning income, and they understand what goes with that flexibility. So I do think there's a shift, and I think that shift is what is driving the increased usage of this type of talent and the increased availability of people that want to work in this workforce. And I do think you're right. I think it's being driven by us as a people and by us, the humans, and the way that we want to live our lives today that, 20 or 30 years ago was a very different story.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in other countries, for example, in the European market, it used to be that they gave them tremendous amounts of time. They would, work in the morning, and then they would have a late lunch, and then they would sleep and come back later in the day and just do it for a couple more hours and go home. And they get like 6 weeks or 2 months even vacation. Now, today, companies can't afford to do that. So it's a little difficult when I hear you talk, and I agree with you that, companies today, or people today rather, like to have a little bit more times with their family, but, how do the companies exist if they have to pay for all that time away and, for when there's like a person who leaves the company for just a little bit because they had a kid or something of that nature. So that's a part of a conundrum that I think the companies are having. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I agree. I think that, companies are really having to shift, the way that they look at talent, but in the way that they look at their workforce and how do they engage them and inspire them. But that is really kind of the point right now, because the talent shortage is real. Companies are now shifting the focus to what motivates the individual. How can we attract and not only attract these people, but keep them? And so I think companies are shifting to allowing that kind of flexible structure. There's so many surveys done and polls done where people would give up income to have flexibility. They'd give up income to be with their families. So companies that are smart and know what is going to motivate and retain their people will look at allowing, some of this flexible work, where it makes sense. And, if you look at today, even now compared to 10 years ago, there's so many more people working remotely. I don't know what the stats are, but they're substantial. So,
listen, I can speak personally. My husband works from the home, and he loves it actually, and he does more work than he ever did before. It's when you love your job, regardless of where you work, whether it's in the company and a different place or in your home, when you have a passion, when you love it, you'll just work as many hours as you can. So, people who say, well, working out of the house, that's a way for a person to, kind of cheat the company, travel and be on the phone and deal with it on that way. But I don't see that. I see a person who really loves a job and thinks, okay, this is my job. I happen to work out of my home, but boy, oh boy, do I love it, and I'll give it everything to it. But I want to go back to something, and that is the book. Let's once more time tell people a little bit more about what is important in the book that you want to, give information about. Tell us a little bit more, and then we're going to wind up the show.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, the segue back to my book. So, really it's comprised of several different components. We start with how did we get here? How did we get so many gig workers, and why are these gig workers here? And, how has the way that we work changed? And then it talks about now that we're here, how do companies, to your point, engage this workforce and attract this workforce, and what our company's total workforce strategy going to look like? Because it's not going to be 100% permanent talent working there 20 years, and how do we not only leverage gig workforce more effectively, to meet bottom line results. And, there's this term called the fluid workforce, which I think Accenture, I can't remember who brought it up, but talked about, the best workforce is a mix of perm and independent and gig workers. But going even beyond that, it's now, the way that we work, it's shifted to the individual, whereas before it was about, you had the CEO, and then you had this top-down kind of patriarchal style of leadership. And now the focus is not about command and control. Now the focus is about how can we motivate the individual? How can we find out what makes them tick and make them happy? Do they need that flexibility? Like, to your point, if you give someone flexibility and allow them to take a couple hours off to go to their kids' play, they're going to work. So they're going to get so much done for you, and they're going to be so much more productive. So I think it's also looking at that and how can companies now understand and leverage this workforce. And then even the final piece is talking about the technology, which is the delivery system for the gig workforce, right? And understanding that technology, not being afraid of it, not being afraid of the robots and the AI, not being afraid of, recruiting networks and hiring somebody that you're going to pay $250 an hour on in an app, and being completely comfortable with that and know that they'll deliver. So understanding that piece. And then the final piece is just the human component. The people participating in this workforce are just like you and me and your neighbors, and they're just as important as your permanent talent, and they're contributing, and they're being there, they're choosing to be there. So it's really just kind of talking about all of those components and doing it through the lens of the human element. This is who we are, and this is the way that we work.
I hear you. Well, my guest today has been Terri Gallagher, author of Death of the Gold Watch, a successful entrepreneur and gig workforce expert. Now, Terri, I always like to give my guest the last word. So if you have an opportunity, which I'm giving to you, what would you want to tell our audience?
I would tell them that if you're working in this economy, I support you. I thank you. You've helped build my company. My entire company is made up of gig workers. I walk the talk. And, I would love for you to pick up this book. I promise you I will write an amazing book. I'm going to spend a lot of time on it. It's going to come from the heart. And I just appreciate all of you listening, and thank you for all that you're doing every day.
Well, thank you again, Terri Gallagher, for being on the Susan Brender Show. It's really been enlightening and a pleasure to have you. So thank you very
Susan.
much.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.